Hey all, I am finally back from my work trip, and I figured I'd make a video kind of looking at the different builds for Arcana, the variations on Empress builds specifically, kind of the skill choices people have, kind of the pros and cons of the different builds. Hopefully it makes it a little bit more clear why people are playing the builds that they're playing, and hopefully if you haven't already chosen a build, kind of gives you an idea of what kind of build you would want to play. There are a lot of different viable variations of Arcana builds right now. So hopefully this video will help you kind of parse through that. The first thing I'm going to look at is our card draw options. Obviously with the changes to Call of Destiny, it is pretty big. Most people have kind of switched from using this as a draw spell to more of the stacking skill, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you can still use Call of Destiny as a draw spell if you would like to. Really the difference between it and evoke is the cooldown is a big one. So obviously if you miss evoke, you're going to be kind of doomed for a while. But Call of Destiny, low cooldown, draw attempts, it fits in the rotation nicely. You can draw during immunity phases, whereas evoke actually has to do damage. Even if the boss is immune, you can fish for cards, which is really nice on Call of Destiny draw. And then the big one here is the interaction, I think, this is why I'm not currently using it, is the interaction with clown and star cards. So pre-patch, a lot of times you wouldn't really be holding on to a lot of cards, so you'd be getting a lot more value out of that double draw chance, like to fill both slots. However, post-patch, you might want to sit on this clown and this star card, just because, one, obviously you want to draw a good card to make the most out of clown, so that's kind of like a no-brainer. The less obvious one is the star card. With the removal of the cooldown reduction on this thing, it's pretty much just a grief card. And a lot of times Arcanas want to sit in boundless mana, but the use of this card is essentially going to guarantee that you're going to be back in endless mana, mana addiction. And the issue with that is, you don't want to use that during like long patterns where you can hit the boss and stuff like that, because typically boundless is going to be pretty key to maintaining good uptime and good stacking and Rune skill detonations. So a lot of times people are going to want to hold this card until the boss goes into a pattern or something like that, which also makes that double draw chance marginally worse than it used to be. So yeah, a lot of people, if they are running a card draw spell, some of these builds just don't run a card draw spell anymore. But if they do run one, it's evoke. And really, the difference here is that it will pretty much generate an entire card on its own with gold wealth on it. So that's currently what I'm playing, but you'll see that like it's essentially one whole card. The only annoying part about it is the cooldown's way longer than what people are typically going to be used to for Call of Destiny. So it's like a 24-second base cooldown. So if you miss, it's kind of doomed. Some other annoying things is sometimes the second activation of this spell, like you can kind of get caught in animation for some reason. Like there are times where I'm like hitting buttons and I'm like trying to hit my second detonation of evoke, but like in certain animations won't let you. So it's 2 key presses instead of 1, which can be pretty annoying. It can be harder to hit because there's a delay. You can't like you can't automatically pop it. You have to wait until it glows back up, right? So it's a little easier to miss, and you get punished a lot more if you miss than for Call of Destiny. Next, let's look at our stacking skill options. Spiral Edge and Scratch Dealer are pretty much set. One thing to note is that if you do drop return in your build, you want to put your crit damage buff on Scratch Dealer instead of the look at my character settings, sorry. Instead of the most builds that run return are going to run this excellent mobility tripod. But if you're not running return, you're going to want your synergy on this skill. But yeah, Scratch Dealer and Spiral Edge are too good to give up essentially. So really it's just what other stack skill options do I have? Obviously there's the new Call of Destiny, which is really nice because it comes out instantly 2 stacks and it has a crit buff attached to it. So if you want to drop return, you could potentially do that. There's also, the thing is with this though, is that balance card usage is one thing to think about as well. If I can draw one. So like, I'm currently using a 2-4-2 build, and once I draw a balance card, I'll show you like, sometimes it's pretty awkward if you're not running like Quadra Accelerator back flush or something. Like if I hit this balance, really the only skill that's going to full stack me is the Scratch Dealer. Like this only gives you 3 stacks, so you still have to do like weird stuff. And then obviously Spiral doesn't full stack you, so like that's the one kind of gripe I have about the build, is how it operates with balance, but that is one thing with Call of Destiny is that it's awkward for stacking. Quadra Accelerate is nice, lower cooldown, it's comfortable. That's what people were using normally. Has a longer animation though. Some people didn't like it, so yeah. Dealer's Flip is kind of the new spell. You can use this one. Let me pull this up real quick. It's not a bad skill. I was debating using it because I was initially going to go a raid captain build. I eventually decided against it, but yeah, it's still not terrible. Essentially how it works is, has a two-part, it stacks to 3. So one cool thing about it is if you use it with the first hit of Scratch Dealer, let me get the stacks off. If you use it with the first hit of Scratch Dealer, you can pretty much instantly stack 4, which is nice. With balance, it stacks 4 instantly. Opposed to Quadra, you instantly stack rather than having it come over time. Yeah, it's not a bad skill. Really, the only really downside of this that I think is its higher cooldown, and then the mobility is forced. So whereas with Quadra, you could kind of move around, or with COD, obviously the animation is instant. The mobility on the skill can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? It just depends on the situation. Another nice thing is that move speed buff is really, really good. So it's 30% for 5 seconds. So if you're using Raid Captain, it does make it a little bit easier to keep that move speed buff and get the bonus from Raid Captain. Cool. Let's look at our Rune skill options. Really, there's only, when you're looking at Rune skills, you could run 3 Rune skills or 4 Rune skills. Really the big choice is like, do I want to run 4 Rune skills, or if I only run 3, do I want to run 4 of a kind or Serendipity? The more common option these days is to run that 4 of a kind card enhancement. So with the buffs to that spell, you actually get a lot more value out of 4 of a kind on average than you do out of Serendipity, just because it has good crit rate on it innately. They buff the damage, and obviously the resets are what people are all about. So on average, you're going to have higher damage. The resets can be like kind of a fun thing that it's got going on, right? And then it's better for stagger and identity generation. One thing that's nice about 4 of a kind is that when you stack fully and you hit 4 of a kind, you'll notice my identity meter goes up significantly. And one thing that's kind of cool about how this works is with Judgment card, it actually, I'm just going to do no cooldowns just so I don't miss any resets. But it actually works on every single hit of this, right? So if you're resetting with Judgment, you're like gaining a shit ton of meter every time. So just kind of an interesting kind of thing of how it works. But yeah, really the downside is dropping that counter, because a lot of the times when you're running a return build, the return is being used off cooldown a lot of times for that crit buff, right? So not having access to Serendipity might make it a little bit harder to hit counters sometimes. Some people do still use Serendipity in 3-3-2 builds. Really, it's better than 4 of a kind with Cole specifically, but it's worse normally. So obviously, if 4 of a kind resets once, it's going to be better value with Judgment. But if it resets more than once, it's way better value. So just one thing to think about between the two builds. Most builds, if they're running 3-3-2, have switched to 4 of a kind. But yeah. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the build variants. There are 2 specifically that I've played a little bit more extensively than the others, which is the 3-3-2 4 of a kind variant, which would be kind of what we talked about here. Your Spiral Scratch +1 stack, so that could be either Quadra or Backflush, or sorry, Dealer's Flip. And then you have your Guard and Rain and your 4 of a kind card enhancement, and then you have your crit stack Call of Destiny and your return as well. So some notes about this build is you could drop the additional stack ability. So instead of running Quadra or Dealer's Flip, you could run Evoke to kind of get a little bit better card draw out of the build, because it does have pretty much the lowest card draw of any of the builds that we listed here, just by the nature of what it's playing. Really what you're giving up is that card draw, but what you're gaining is you're getting a really high uptime on that crit damage buff. So on return, you have the 5 seconds on that crit damage buff, and then Call of Destiny you have 3. But essentially you're able to kind of like weave those in and out and pretty much have 100% uptime on your Rune skills, which matters a lot more for Four of a Kind than it does for Serendipity. Another thing that's nice about the build is that if you do miss a stacking skill, you do have more options. So some of these other like 3-4-1 builds or the 2-4-2 builds, if you miss a stacking skill, you're kind of just SOL until it comes back up because there's no redundancy built in. So those builds are essentially assuming you're hitting like every ability. So it has a super solid floor as a result, and you don't really have to do anything like super wild execution heavy to get a really good performance out of the build. Like I mentioned earlier, it's card draws on the lower end, and the counter is typically used off cooldown, so it may not be up for things like that. But yeah, it's overall, this is kind of the build that I would recommend for people new to the class or people coming into Arcana. I would definitely go this build, and it's the one that a lot of the Arcanas in Korea are using as well. There's also 3-2 Seren, which is kind of just the same build as before. Really, it's just high comfort. Nothing has really changed with this build. A lot of times, because of the way that Serendipity works and gets better with cards, they'll run the standard Call of Destiny draw instead of the crit buff. Really, where it gets weird is the 4 rune skill builds. So this is kind of what I've been playing a lot of 2-4-2 and the 3-3-2 4 of a kind stuff. So I have kind of a good idea of how this stuff works. Really, what you're trading when you go these 4 rune skill builds is you're trading kind of comfort and floor for like a theoretical ceiling, essentially, right? So just looking at like the build itself, right? You have your draw spell and you have 4 rune skills, and the rune skills aren't using for this build. This 2-4-2 build. The rune skills aren't using deception or anything like that. So it's just damage, right? You're essentially banking on the fact that you're going to get a judgment card, because if you get a judgment card, your lack of stack skills are less of an issue because you just hit all your buttons off cooldown and they do max damage, and your burst window is insane in this build. So some of the weird things with this build though is that crit damage buff window. So because you're dropping return, obviously the crit damage buff is only 3 seconds. So it can be a little tighter for execution to get all that stuff in the window. So if I was going to go through like a standard rotation here, it's a little bit tighter to get the 2. I don't know what. Oh, it's because I don't have cooldowns on. Okay. Let me do that again. It's a little bit tighter if you notice the cooldown, the crit buff on my bar, to get that in the window. Whereas with return, it was very, very lenient. Oh, lenient to the point where like with certain cards you could get 3 ruin skills in one window. But obviously with this 3-second buff, that's not an option, right? The rotation is really, really weird. What you'll notice is like a lot of times it's trying to go into boundless mana as soon as possible, and that's kind of the way that it works, right? So a lot of times like you have to use 4 of a kind without any stacks or anything, just to try to like get into boundless as soon as possible. Because the reason is, if you're seeing right now, is I didn't hit any resets on 4 of a kind. I didn't go into boundless, so my stack skills were limiting my ability to hit my ruin skills. My stack skills could not support my ruin skills whatsoever. However, if like now with perfect cards, right, this is like the ideal situation where you're kind of just gonna like pop off, because now you can just hit all your abilities and just like pop off, right? I'll show you what it looks like when you're actually in boundless. So now that we're in boundless, right, I'm gonna just like try to keep it up. So now that we're in boundless, the cooldowns are actually much more manageable, right? You can use these 2 stack skills as like your main stack skills the entire time. And I'm not really good using any cards or anything like that. But the point of this build is to kind of sit in boundless as much as possible, because if you go out of boundless, your stacking skills no longer support your stuff. So it's kind of an interesting build. I've been messing around with it a lot. It's pretty hard to play unless you have really high cooldown gems. So I think everything I've read kind of requires level 9 gems. But if you're into trying new things, then you might as well try it. The things with this as well is, obviously I talked about the balance cards, and then you're kind of giving up a lot of base rotation damage that you'd get on 3-3-2 for more damage when you have good card combos. So kind of the logic follows that if you can't execute those card combos correctly, you're going to lose a lot of damage. So the execution requirements on these 4 ruin builds are typically going to be higher than what you would see on the 3-3-2 builds. And then the other builds that I want to talk about is this 341 Deception build, which is also used in Korea, a little bit less popular these days, but still something that's used. A lot of times they'll go Quadra Accelerate. Sorry, let me take one out of here. So a lot of times this will be this, and then their key difference is this Deception tripod. So what this does is it has a chance to not consume stacks when you use the ability. That is terrible. Let me switch this real quick. I need a skill rune on here too. I need something. Oh, please help. I'll just take a quick recharge off this for now. But yeah, the real gameplay with this build that's interesting is you're trying to... did I even save? Okay. You are trying to get the most out of using this and not proccing the stacks on this. So the interesting thing with this build is that it's kind of taking the average, because 75% of the time you're gonna grief your cycle really hard because you're gonna proc this stack. I should play this build. Apparently I'm just a god. All right, you're gonna proc this stack eventually. Maybe not. You're gonna proc this stack, and then you're gonna rip another skill, and you're not gonna have a stack. So the way this normally works is you rip it before you rip an ability. So the average damage typically is going to be a little higher than just having the ability itself do the damage. So you're kind of just like inputting it when you can in front of the ability you're going to use. So there's a couple of interesting things with this build that are kind of cool to mention. Is the identity generation, even though it's not running, typically it's not running a card draw skill, the identity generation is actually not that bad, because what you'll notice on these 4 of a kinds that don't proc stacks is you're still getting full... Whenever I want it to proc stacks and not proc stacks, it just does the opposite. You'll notice you're getting like full card identity generation, and you get to keep the stack, so you get more card identity generation on the next one. So it actually has really good card identity generation, even though it doesn't run a draw spell. So yeah, I mean, obviously this isn't super in-depth on these builds. When I'm done testing more and I kind of settle on the one that I really want to play, right now it's kind of in between 242 and then this 332 4 of a kind. I'll do a little bit more on kind of the rotation and stuff like that, but this is just the general overview of kind of the stuff that people are playing. And really it's just, hey, let's... once you familiarize yourself with how it works, and you kind of get to try a bunch of different ones in Trixion, you can kind of come to your own conclusion. This is kind of as I've been testing it, my opinions on this. So ease of use, obviously the 332 builds are going to be the easiest. I actually think 341 is probably the hardest, just because if you're playing this optimally, you're kind of reacting to whether or not you proc the thing. So I didn't proc it, so I would have to do this. And then I didn't proc it, so I could keep going, right? But there are times when you proc it and you have to react, and then maybe you save that Rune skill and you don't send the next one, right? Also, like, because it's a 4 Rune skill, your windows for hitting Judgment are really tight as well with all the 4 of a kinds that you have to weave in. So I do think that 341 is probably the highest execution requirements. And then, like, obviously both the 4 Rune skills and then just the 332. I would say the ceiling on 242 is probably the highest, just because when you run Deception on 4 of a kind, you're actually losing a pretty good amount of damage. That tripod alone is like 75% damage or something. So when you're looking at card enhancement, like, that's 75% off the stacking. So like with things like Judgment or Judgment Coal, the 242 build is going to just have theoretically the highest damage in that burst window. 341 would be next, because obviously you're running that extra Ruin spell, then you have your 332 variants. The floor on the 332 variants are obviously going to be higher, though, because one, your base rotation in the 332 build is really, really clean and has like 100% uptime on this crit buff, whereas the 4 Ruin builds, a lot of times to run the 4 Ruin skills, they're kind of making compromises in other areas, whether that be card draw or whether that be crypt buff uptime or requiring boundless mana, stuff like that. Sometimes the rotations in the 3-4-1 builds can be a little hard to get used to, whereas 3-2 kind of just like flows really well, and it's really hard to go wrong. And then for card draw, I think the variants that run evoke, so either your 2-4-2 with evoke or your 3-3-2 with evoke, are going to probably have the most card draw if you do decide to run those. And then from there, it's going to be your 3-4-1 just because of how 4 of a kind interacts with card stack or identity stacks, and then 2-4-2, and then 3-3-2 at the end of that. So yeah, just kind of a quick overview of my stuff. I'll probably put up a quick video of some parsing of my 2-4-2 as well. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Obviously, this isn't like the super in-depth guide. This is kind of a primer of like, hey, these are the pros and cons of what people are thinking about when they're choosing their builds. And I look forward to see what you guys have to say. So.